Welcome back everyone to this lecture on the null-if function. The null-if function takes in just two inputs and returns null if both are equal, otherwise it returns the first argument passed. So the syntax we're going to be using is you say null-if and then pass in the two arguments. So for example, if you pass in 10 and 10 into the null-if function, since 10 is equal to 10, it's going to return null. However, if you were to pass in 10 and 12, since those are not equal to each other, it's going to return 10. This becomes very useful in cases where a null value would cause an error or an unwanted result. Let's go ahead and show an example of this. So let's imagine we have this particular very simple table and we want to calculate the ratio of people in department A to department B. So for example, we have the three entries, so Lauren, Vincent, and Claire, and their departments, so A, and B. And we can easily see here that the ratio of A to B is 2 to 1, or 200%. So we can actually use SQL to solve this with a case statement. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump to pgadmin, quickly create this table, and then walk through solving that ratio. And then I'm going to edit this table slightly to show you why you may need a null-if statement. Okay, let's jump to pgadmin and quickly create this table. All right, here I am in pgadmin. The first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm not editing an existing database like the DVD rental database. Instead, go ahead and create a database specifically for testing purposes. If you haven't done so already from previous lectures, go ahead and right-click on PostgreSQL and create a new database. You can call it whatever you want and then just hit save. So I've called mine test.me and it's for testing purposes. So here I have under test.me, I'm going to right click and then set up my query tool. So confirm that your query tool is connected to this test database by reading the tab here. Notice now right here it says test.me PostgreSQL. Okay, so now that I'm in this test database, let's create this simple table. We'll say create table, and let's call this table just DPTS for departments. And it's very simple. It just has two columns, which is the first name column. So let's say first name. And the first name, let's just make it a variable character up to 50, no constraints. And then the second one is going to be the actual department they're in. So that will also be variable character. Let's go ahead and say 50 and make sure we put a comma here so we don't get an error. So again, very simple table, just holds departments, same one we saw on the slides, a first name and a department letter. So we'll go ahead and run this, and that table has been created successfully. Now let's go ahead and insert into this table. So I can do that. Let me delete this create table. We'll say insert into departments, and I'm going to be inserting first name, no longer need that variable character, and I'm also going to be inserting department. And then after this insert command, recall that we have values, and then we say what values we're actually going to insert. So I want to insert the same ones, or roughly the same ones that I had in the slides. So let's go ahead and say, whoops, single quote here, Vinton, we'll have this person be in department A, comma, another entry here. We're going to have Lauren, this person is also in department A, and then finally, we'll have Claire, and this person is in department B. So pretty simple here, and then we're going to end it with semicolon just to clarify that's the end of our statement. So we're inserting into the departments table, first name and department, Vinton, Lauren, and Claire. Go ahead and run that. The insert should have returned successfully. If not, make sure you're checking for typos such as missing commas. And then what I want to do is confirm all this by selecting everything from this new departments table. Run that, and I can see here the results. I have Vinton, Lauren, and Claire. Okay, so as I mentioned, let's imagine that I wanted to calculate the ratio between male and female members. So the way I can do that is actually using a case statement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select, and this is where we're going to be doing a sum call. So I'm going to sum up the case when department is equal to A, then 1, else 0, and I'm just writing this kind of as a one-liner. So what is that doing? It's just going to essentially count up how many people are in the department. So that should just create an extra column with ones for the A's and then zeros for the B's. And then what I want to do is sum that up. So essentially this is going to be equal to 2 since there's 2 A's. And then I'm going to take this. Let's go ahead and then make sure our parentheses are okay. So I'm going to take that result and I'm going to divide it by the sum of the case when department is equal to B, then 1, else 0, end. So what is this actually doing? This is basically, again, adding up all the A's. So this is going to be equal to 2. And then this is adding up all the B's equal to 1. And then we're going to take those two sums and then divide this sum using this division operator with this sum. Okay, so that should get me a 2-to-1 ratio, right? So then 2 divided by 1 should be equal to 2. And then what I'm going to do here is, after this, what I'm going to say is as, and let's call this the department ratio. So we'll say department underscore ratio. And I'm doing this all from this departments table. Okay, so again, doing those sums, dividing it to get the ratio as department ratio from departments. Go ahead and run this, and you should get back 2, since there was 2 A's to 1 B. So far, nothing too crazy, and we haven't actually used the nullif function yet. So what I'm going to do is now show you what happens if there actually are no more people in department B. Let's go ahead and say that person in department B left. So that means currently we have no person in department B. To do this, I'm going to delete this code. And don't worry, it's still available to us in our query history as long as we ran it. And then I'm going to type out delete from departments, and I'm just going to delete where department is equal to B. So run that, and notice that deleted 1 row. So let's go ahead and say select from departments, run this, and now I only have people from department A. So let's go ahead and see what happens if I try running that same ratio. So I'm going to go to my query history, and note here I have the select command, the delete command, and I have this select sum. So go ahead and copy this to your query editor, or you can retype it again if you wanted to, but I just copied from query history to our query editor. Run that same code again, and you'll notice that you get an error. This error makes sense because we are currently dividing by 0, which you cannot do. So how can we use the nullif functionality in order to make sure that instead of getting an error, we just get back a null? A null is a good indication that there essentially is no one in one of these departments, instead of having a full error, in which case it's not really clear what's happening. So what we're going to do is use the nullif around this second one right here in order to say return a null if there happens to be a 0 there. So the way I do that is recall that nullif is going to return a null if they both match. So that means if both arguments match both arguments I passed to nullif, then it returns a null. And right now I want to return a null if this entire sum happens to be 0. So what I'm going to do is pass in this entire sum call, go ahead and cut that and paste that, into nullif, and then the second parameter I'm passing into the nullif, and be careful of your parentheses here, is going to be 0. So what this is saying is if both of these happen to be equal to each other, meaning if the result of this sum is equal to 0, return a null. Otherwise, if these don't happen to be equal to each other, so this sum is actually returning something, then just return the first argument. So keep in mind, order does matter within this nullif function, because it's going to return the first one if they don't happen to be equal to each other. So now when I run this, instead of getting an error, it's going to return back a null. Because if you try to divide something by a null, then that simply returns a null instead of a division by 0 error. So a really common use case for a nullif is just to check against something, and specifically with the way databases are often designed, to check against something being equal to 0. And then if it happens to be equal to that, go ahead and return a null instead. Okay, so definitely take your time with this one. I know the code's a little bit complex here because we're using this case statement, but if you just take your time and read through the logic of what's happening here, it's pretty understandable that we're essentially just using null if as a check against returning a 0. Okay, thanks, and I'll see you at the next lecture.